It was a cold night in Italy, the kind of silence that makes every sound echo through the narrow medieval streets of Perugia. Inside a quiet student house, the calm was shattered. A young British student was found in her room, and what should have been a straightforward investigation quickly spiraled into one of the most debated cases of the 21st century. At the center of it all stood Amanda Knox, a 21-year-old American who had come to Italy searching for independence and adventure. Within hours, she was no longer just a student abroad. She was the focus of a storm that would grip the world. The scene was unsettling, blood traces in unexpected places, a window broken as if to suggest a break-in, and whispers among investigators that something did not add up. But what truly captured attention was Amanda herself. While others expected shock and grief, her behavior seemed unusual. Smiling at times, kissing her boyfriend, even making comments that the press quickly twisted into a narrative of cold detachment. The Italian media gave her a name that would follow her for years, Foxy Knoxy. Overnight, she became a symbol of mystery, suspicion, and controversy. And here lies one of the most surprising details. Before any trial had even begun, public opinion had already condemned her. From that moment, the case was no longer just about evidence. It became a battle of perception, of how a young woman's personality could be dissected and weaponized by headlines. Families were torn apart, careers destroyed, and the world found itself asking a haunting question. Was Amanda Knox an innocent caught in a nightmare, or was there something darker behind her smile? This was not just an investigation. It was the beginning of a global obsession, a story that blurred the line between fact and spectacle. If stories like this intrigue you, real cases that feel stranger than fiction, stay with us. Because what unfolded in Perugia would challenge justice, ignite media frenzy, and leave questions that remain unanswered to this day. The year is 2007. The ancient city of Perugia rises from the Italian hills like something out of a storybook. Cobblestone streets narrow enough to touch both walls at once, terracotta rooftops glowing amber in the afternoon sun, and church bells marking time the way they have for centuries. This is the kind of place where history whispers from every corner, where students from around the world come not just to study, but to transform. Among them was a young woman from Seattle named Amanda Knox, 20 years old, bright blue eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her, a restless energy that friends described as magnetic. She had packed her life into 2 suitcases and crossed an ocean, searching for something many her age dream about: independence, adventure, the chance to become someone new in a place where nobody knew her name. What she found was a small apartment, shared with other young women navigating the same thrilling uncertainty of being far from home. And there, in that house with its creaking floors and mismatched furniture, she met Meredith Kercher. Meredith was everything Amanda wasn't, or at least, that's how it appeared on the surface. Where Amanda seemed to throw herself into experiences without looking back, Meredith moved through life with quiet intention. She kept to a schedule, studied diligently, sent letters home to England regularly. Friends spoke of her warmth, her gentle laugh, the way she made you feel heard when you talked to her. In the beginning, their differences didn't seem to matter. They were just 2 young women sharing space, sharing stories over morning coffee, navigating the beautiful chaos of being students abroad. The house hummed with the ordinary sounds of early adulthood, late-night conversations, the smell of pasta cooking, music drifting from open windows. But beneath the surface, something was quietly shifting. Amanda's spontaneity, the late parties, the new boyfriend she'd met just days after arriving, the singing in the shower at odd hours, began to stand in contrast to Meredith's more reserved approach to life. Some who visited noticed the difference. A tension that wasn't quite conflict, but wasn't quite comfort either. The kind of friction that happens when different rhythms try to occupy the same space. And then, after only a few weeks of this fragile coexistence, everything shattered. It was the morning of November 2nd, 2007, when someone noticed the door to Meredith's room was locked from the inside. Strange, they thought. She should have been at class. The silence from behind that door felt wrong somehow, heavy, like the air pressure had changed. When authorities finally opened it, They found Meredith Kercher in a way that would change countless lives forever. The promising young student from London was gone. The investigation that followed would not just seek answers about what happened in that room. It would spiral into something far more complex, a collision of justice systems, media frenzy, cultural misunderstandings, and one American girl who would wake up to find herself at the center of a storm she never saw coming. Because what no one realized yet, not the police gathering evidence, not the reporters already arriving in Perugia, not Amanda Knox herself, was that this wasn't just the beginning of an investigation. This was the beginning of an obsession that would grip the entire world. When the door finally gave way, the investigators who stepped inside knew immediately that something terrible had unfolded here. The bathroom told the first part of the story. Crimson traces smeared across the sink. Droplets scattered on the tile floor like some dark constellation. Footprints, faint but unmistakable, led down the hallway. Personal items sat where they shouldn't be, as if the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to notice. And then there was Meredith's door, locked from the inside. The officers exchanged glances. One of them called out her name. Silence answered back, the kind that makes your skin prickle with dread. They forced entry, and what they discovered in that small bedroom would send shockwaves through Italy and far beyond. Meredith Kercher had been attacked with devastating violence. The wound to her neck suggested a swift, brutal act. The scene immediately raised disturbing questions about what had transpired in those final moments. Whether she had been alone with her attacker, whether there had been a struggle, whether multiple people had been involved. But even as forensic teams began their meticulous work, something about the entire scene felt off. A window had been shattered, glass scattered both inside and out, suggesting someone had broken in from outside. It looked like a burglary gone horribly wrong. Except the more investigators examined it, the more wrong it seemed. The glass pattern didn't make sense. Valuables remained untouched. The break-in looked almost theatrical, as if someone had staged it after the fact to point suspicion elsewhere. And here's where the story takes its first truly unexpected turn, because while the evidence was speaking one language, the living were speaking another. Amanda Knox, the American roommate who had discovered something was wrong and called the authorities, began to draw attention for reasons that had nothing to do with forensics or fingerprints. It was her behavior that investigators found themselves unable to look away from. She didn't seem traumatized, at least not in the way people expected. While others stood in quiet shock outside the house, witnesses reported seeing Amanda embracing and kissing her new boyfriend, Raffaele Solicito. At the police station, while waiting to give statements, she was observed stretching and doing yoga poses. She made comments that struck some as oddly detached. At one point, according to reports, she told someone that Meredith had died because her throat had been slit, offering this information with what seemed like disturbing casualness, before investigators had even publicly released details about how Meredith had been found. Now, here's something many people don't know. Grief looks different on everyone. Psychologists have documented countless cases where trauma manifests not as tears and collapse, but as unusual cheerfulness, nervous laughter, or emotional flatness. The human mind, when confronted with horror, sometimes simply refuses to process it in expected ways. But in Perugia, in that moment, with media beginning to circle like hawks catching a scent, Amanda's reactions weren't interpreted through the lens of psychology. They were interpreted as guilt. The Italian press descended with ferocious speed. Newspapers began using a nickname that Amanda had used once on social media, a playful moniker from her soccer days. Foxy Knoxy, the headlines screamed. The name transformed overnight from an inside joke among friends into something dark and loaded with implication. Cunning, predatory, dangerous. Television programs analyzed every photograph of her. The way she smiled, the way she dressed, her past relationships. One tabloid published a story claiming she kept vibrators and lubricant visible in the bathroom. Scandalous behavior that they suggested revealed a sexually deviant nature. Never mind that she was a 20-year-old college student living away from home for the first time. Within 48 hours, before any charges had been filed, before any evidence had been fully analyzed, Amanda Knox had been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. The prosecution began building their theory. This wasn't a random break-in. This was something far more sinister, perhaps a twisted encounter that had spiraled out of control, with Amanda at the center of it. But the evidence? That was murkier. DNA traces were found, yes, but whose? And from when? The house had been shared by multiple people. Friends visited regularly. Determining what was significant and what was contamination would prove nearly impossible. Meanwhile, investigators zeroed in on inconsistencies in Amanda's statements. She had initially said she was at Raphael's apartment all night. Then details shifted. She seemed confused about the timeline. To the police, this looked like someone scrambling to cover their tracks. To Amanda's defenders, it looked like a terrified young woman whose second language was Italian, who was being interrogated without a lawyer, who was exhausted and overwhelmed and trying desperately to help find answers about what had happened to her roommate. The truth, as it often does, sat somewhere in that uncomfortable space between perception and reality. But in Perugia, as autumn deepened and the medieval city buzzed with rumors and accusations, the truth was already losing ground to the story, and the story the world was hearing was about a young American woman whose smile seemed just a little too bright, whose grief seemed just a little too absent, whose very presence in that house was beginning to feel like a confession. The stage was set for something unprecedented, an investigation that would become less about following evidence and more about confirming what everyone had already decided they knew. It was the night of November 5th, 2007, just 3 days after Meredith's body had been found. Amanda Knox and her boyfriend, Raphael Solicito, were brought into the Perugia police station for questioning. The building's fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The air felt close, heavy with cigarette smoke and tension. What happened in those interrogation rooms over the next several hours would become one of the most hotly contested elements of the entire case. To this day, two completely different versions of that night exist. According to Amanda, she walked into that room believing she was there to help. A witness, not a suspect. She had been texting with friends, waiting at the station to give another statement. It was late. She was exhausted. And then, suddenly, the tone shifted. She would later describe investigators surrounding her, their voices rising. No lawyer was present. Italian law at the time didn't require one during preliminary questioning. Her Italian was conversational at best, picked up over just a few weeks in Perugia. The translator provided, she would claim, was not properly certified and struggled to keep up with the rapid-fire interrogation. "You're lying," they told her, over and over. "We know you were there. We know what you did." Hours passed. Amanda said she asked for water, for a break, for someone to call the American embassy. The requests, she claimed, were ignored or denied. The room felt like it was spinning. She couldn't think straight. The investigators kept pushing, insisting she remember things she said she couldn't remember, accusing her of protecting someone. And here's a detail that sends chills down the spine of anyone who studies interrogation psychology. Amanda later described one officer slapping her on the back of the head, telling her to concentrate harder. Whether this actually happened remains disputed. The police denied any physical contact. But what's not disputed is that after somewhere between 14 and 53 hours of sporadic questioning over several days, Amanda's resistance finally crumbled. She signed a statement. In it, she implicated Patrick Lumumba, a Congolese man who owned a bar where she occasionally worked. According to the statement, Amanda claimed she had been at the house that night and heard Meredith's screams from another room. She said Patrick was there, that he was the one who attacked Meredith while Amanda covered her ears in the kitchen, trying to block out the sounds. The police acted immediately. Patrick was arrested at his home and thrown into custody. Except there was one catastrophic problem. Patrick Lumumba was completely innocent. His alibi was ironclad. Multiple witnesses confirmed he had been working at his bar the entire evening, serving customers visible to dozens of people. Security footage backed up the timeline. Within weeks, he was released. But by then, his life had been devastated. His business suffered. His reputation was shattered. The accusation, however false, clung to him like a shadow. And for investigators, Amanda's false accusation became the smoking gun they'd been looking for. If she would lie about Patrick, what else was she lying about? To them, it looked like a desperate attempt to deflect blame. The theory evolved. Amanda must have been involved, and now she was scrambling to pin it on someone else. But here's what many people don't realize about false confessions. They happen far more often than we want to believe. Research has shown that after prolonged interrogation, sleep deprivation, and psychological pressure, people will confess to things they didn't do. They'll even create detailed false memories, filling in blanks their exhausted minds invent. It's not rational, but trauma and exhaustion don't operate on rational rules. Amanda would later recant the statement, saying she had only signed it because she genuinely believed in that moment of confusion and fear that maybe her memory was wrong. Maybe she had been there and blocked it out. The interrogators seemed so certain. Maybe they knew something she didn't. The prosecution saw manipulation. The defense saw coercion. And while the world watched this drama unfold on television screens across continents, while newspapers printed increasingly sensational theories about what had happened in that house, the forensic teams were making a discovery that would crack the case wide open. DNA evidence from the scene, biological traces that couldn't be explained away or disputed, pointed to someone else entirely. A man named Rudy Guede. His genetic material was found in multiple locations in Meredith's room. His handprint was on the wall. His DNA was unmistakable, undeniable. And yet, strangely, no one had been looking for him. The investigation had been so focused on Amanda and Raphael that this other presence had initially slipped through the cracks. When authorities finally identified Guede and began searching for him, they discovered he had already fled Italy. He was apprehended days later in Germany, on a train headed further from the crime scene, carrying a knife that would later raise even more questions. Finally, it seemed, investigators had found the real perpetrator. But the story didn't end there, because Rudy Guede had his own version of events to tell. And what he said would throw gasoline on a fire that was already raging out of control. He claimed he hadn't acted alone. He said Amanda and Raphael had been there too. Now 3 people stood accused. The evidence was fragmentary, contradictory, and increasingly politicized. And the world was left asking an impossible question. How could the truth be so elusive when so many people seemed so certain they knew exactly what had happened? His name was Rudy Guede, 20 years old, originally from the Ivory Coast, raised in Italy since childhood. He drifted through Perugia's social circles, not quite inside, not quite outside. People knew his face from the basketball courts, from cafes, from late-night gatherings. He had a history of petty offenses, break-ins, theft, the kind of record that made him familiar to local police, but never quite serious enough to keep him locked up. And when forensic analysts began processing the evidence from Meredith's room, his presence was undeniable. His DNA wasn't just at the scene, it was everywhere that mattered. Biological traces inside the room where Meredith had taken her last breath. A clear handprint on the wall, preserved in blood, matching his palm exactly. Shoe prints that forensic experts could tie directly to shoes he owned. The evidence didn't whisper his involvement, it screamed it. This should have been the moment everything clicked into place. The mystery solved, the investigation complete, except Rudy Guede was gone. The moment he realized investigators were closing in, he vanished from Perugia. He didn't just leave town, he left the country entirely. Days later, German authorities found him on a train traveling through their territory, moving further and further from Italy, as if distance alone could erase what had happened. He was carrying a knife. When Italian authorities brought him back, the world expected a confession, a clear explanation, the final piece of the puzzle. And in a way, that's what they got, but not the way anyone anticipated. Rudy admitted he'd been in the house that night. Yes, he knew Meredith. Yes, he'd been in her room. But according to him, he hadn't acted alone. He painted a picture of that evening that seemed almost impossible to believe. Amanda Knox and Raffaele Solicito had been there too, he claimed. They had all been involved. The story he told was fragmented, shifting each time he recounted it. But the core accusation remained steady. He wasn't the only one responsible, he insisted. They were all there. And here's where the case spirals into territory that seems ripped from fiction. The prosecution seized on Rudy's statement and constructed a theory so shocking, so lurid, that it dominated headlines across the world. According to their narrative, what happened that night wasn't a burglary gone wrong or a random act of violence. It was something far more disturbing, a situation involving all three suspects that had escalated out of control, driven by a twisted encounter that ended in tragedy. They described Amanda as the ringleader, manipulative, and sexually aggressive. They suggested Meredith had refused to participate and paid the ultimate price. The theory had almost no physical evidence supporting it, no DNA linking Amanda or Raphael to the actual attack, no witnesses, no clear motive, but it had something perhaps more powerful. It fit the narrative the media had already been selling. Here's something that often gets lost in retellings. The prosecution's timeline kept changing. First, they said the incident happened at one time. Then forensic evidence contradicted that, so they adjusted. They claimed certain weapons were used. Then those weapons were never found or didn't match the wounds. Key pieces of their story didn't align with basic facts. Yet the theory persisted because it was compelling in a dark, sensational way, and the public ate it up. Opinion polls showed that significant portions of both Italian and international audiences believed the prosecution's version. Not because the evidence was strong, experts would later tear it apart piece by piece, but because the story felt complete. It had villains. It had motive. It answered the question everyone was desperate to answer. Why would this have happened? But here's a lesser-known fact that reveals just how flawed the investigation had become. Rudy Guade was offered a fast-track trial in Italy, a process where defendants get reduced sentences in exchange for expedited proceedings. He took it. He was convicted and sentenced to 30 years, later reduced to 16. His trial lasted mere months. Amanda and Raphael, meanwhile, faced a full trial that would stretch over a year, with far less physical evidence connecting them to the scene than connected Rudy. The disparity was staggering. The person with DNA throughout the crime scene got a shortened process and reduced time. The two with contested evidence faced the full weight of Italy's judicial system and international media scrutiny. As the case moved toward trial, something became painfully clear. This was no longer just about finding out what happened to Meredith Kercher. It had transformed into something else entirely. A media spectacle, a cultural battleground, a story where facts struggled to compete with the narratives people wanted to believe. Television trucks lined the streets outside the courthouse in Perugia. Reporters from 5 continents filed daily updates. Every detail of Amanda's life, her diary entries, her sexual history, photos from college parties, was dissected and debated on international television. Meredith's family pleaded for dignity, for the focus to remain on their daughter. But the machinery of modern media had taken over, and it was hungry for drama. The trial was about to begin, and nothing, not the inconsistencies in the evidence, not the questions about investigative procedures, not the lack of clear motive, would prepare anyone for just how divisive and controversial the proceedings would become. Because in that courtroom, 2 versions of reality were about to collide, and the world was watching. The year is 2009. Inside a medieval courthouse in Perugia, Italy, the world watches as 2 young lives hang in the balance. Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito sit in a courtroom that has become the center of a global media firestorm. Camera flashes explode outside. Reporters from dozens of countries crowd the stone corridors. This is no longer just a trial. It's a spectacle. The prosecution paints a disturbing portrait. Amanda, they say, is manipulative, cold, dangerous. Television programs dissect every gesture she makes, every expression on her face. Newspapers compete to publish the most sensational theories, each one more outlandish than the last. The young woman who once dreamed of studying in Italy has become, in the eyes of many, a villain straight out of a twisted fairy tale. But then the defense stands up. Their message is simple, yet explosive. This entire investigation is built on a foundation of sand. They point to the DNA evidence. Experts take the stand and raise troubling questions about contamination. How was the evidence collected? Who handled it? Under what conditions? The answers are deeply unsettling. They highlight the proposed motive for the crime. It seems paper-thin, almost absurd when examined closely. And the testimonies? They contradict each other in ways that would be laughable if the stakes weren't so terrifyingly high. Here's something most people don't know. During the trial, one forensic expert actually admitted that the DNA sample found on the alleged weapon was so small, so degraded, that it couldn't be reliably tested by the standards of most international labs. Yet it was still presented as crucial evidence. But none of this seems to matter. The verdict comes down like a hammer. Amanda Knox, 26 years in prison. Rafael Solicito, 25 years. The courtroom erupts. Outside, the world fractures into two camps. Some celebrate, convinced that justice has finally caught up with the guilty. Others recoil in horror, seeing not justice, but a young woman convicted less on evidence and more on how she looked, how she acted, how she failed to perform grief the way society expected. You can feel the weight of those iron doors closing. You can hear the echo of Amanda's footsteps as she's led back to her cell. 26 years, nearly half a lifetime, gone. If this story is gripping you the way it gripped millions around the world, take a moment to like this video. It helps us bring you more real cases that reveal the complexities of justice and human nature. But here's the thing that no one in that courtroom could have predicted. This wasn't the end, not even close. Because in the years to come, everything would be turned upside down once again. New evidence would emerge. Appeals would be filed. And the world would be forced to ask itself a question it had already thought it answered. What really happened that night in Perugia? The truth was still waiting to be uncovered. 2011. After years of legal warfare, something unprecedented happens. Independent forensic experts are called in to examine the evidence with fresh eyes. No media pressure, no preconceptions, just science. The courtroom holds its breath as the report is delivered. And what they find changes everything. The DNA evidence, the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, begins to crumble. Sample after sample is deemed inconclusive. The experts speak carefully, methodically, but their conclusion is devastating. Contamination is not just possible, it's probable. The chain of custody was broken. The testing methods were questionable. The results, unreliable. The foundation of Amanda's conviction doesn't just crack, it collapses entirely. And then comes the announcement that echoes around the world. Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito are acquitted. Picture this moment. Amanda, who has spent nearly 4 years behind bars, hearing those words. Her knees buckle. Tears stream down her face. The courtroom explodes into chaos, cameras clicking like a thunderstorm, voices shouting in Italian, English, every language imaginable. Within hours, she's on a plane. The airport in Italy is a war zone of flashing lights and shouting reporters. Amanda moves through it like someone in a dream, or maybe a nightmare she's desperate to wake from. When she lands in Seattle, it's no different. Hundreds of journalists pack the terminal. Cameras thrust into her face. Questions screamed from every direction. Here's something remarkable that rarely gets mentioned. During her flight home, Amanda later revealed she couldn't stop looking out the window, terrified that somehow the plane would turn around, that it was all a mistake, that she'd wake up back in her cell. Freedom felt too fragile to believe in, but the world remains split down the middle. To some, she is a survivor. A young woman who endured an unimaginable ordeal at the hands of a flawed system. A cautionary tale about media trials and rush to judgment. They see her stepping off that plane and think, there but for the grace of circumstance go any of us. To others, she is something else entirely. Someone who slipped through the fingers of justice. The doubts linger like smoke that won't clear. And just when everyone thought the story had reached its conclusion, just when Amanda began trying to rebuild a life shattered by 4 years in prison and a lifetime of headlines, the case takes an even more disturbing turn, because the acquittal doesn't bring peace. It doesn't bring closure. Instead, it reignites the battle. The Italian legal system has a provision that most people outside the country don't understand. Cases can be retried under certain circumstances, and the prosecution isn't finished. Not by a long shot. They file appeals. They challenge the independent experts. They argue that justice was not served, only delayed. Amanda is free, but she's not safe. Not really. The question hanging in the air is suffocating. Could she be forced to go back? Could the nightmare begin all over again? The legal war that divided the world is about to enter its most shocking chapter yet. And this time, the stakes are even higher. What happens next sounds like something from a legal thriller, except it's terrifyingly real. The case enters a loop, a maddening cycle that seems to defy logic itself. Italian courts overturn previous decisions. New trials are ordered. Convictions that were erased suddenly reappear like ghosts that refuse to stay buried. The legal system twists and turns in ways that leave even seasoned lawyers shaking their heads in disbelief. Then comes 2014. Amanda Knox, living in Seattle, trying desperately to piece together something resembling a normal life, receives news that stops her heart. She has been found guilty. Again. From across an ocean, an Italian court has convicted her in absentia. The verdict feels like a hand reaching across the Atlantic, dragging her back into the nightmare she thought had ended. She faces the very real possibility of extradition, of being torn from her home and sent back to an Italian prison. The world reacts with shock. How is this possible? How can someone be acquitted, then convicted, then acquitted, then convicted again? It feels less like justice and more like a cruel game with no rules. But Amanda can't afford to think that way. She has to keep fighting. 2015 arrives, and with it, a final reckoning. The Italian Supreme Court, the highest judicial authority in the country, gathers to deliver what everyone hopes will be the last word on this case. The deliberation takes hours. Outside the courthouse, reporters camp out in the cold, their breath visible in the winter air. In Seattle, Amanda waits by her phone, unable to eat, unable to sleep. And then, the decision. Not guilty, definitively, finally. The Supreme Court doesn't just acquit Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito. They dismantle the case piece by piece. The judges acknowledge what many had been saying for years. The investigation was riddled with serious flaws. The evidence was inconsistent. The conclusions drawn were not supported by the facts. Here's something most people never learned. In their written decision, the judges used language rarely seen in Italian Supreme Court rulings, essentially stating that the narrative constructed by the prosecution was not just flawed, but stunted and implausible. It was as close to an official rebuke of the investigation as the system allows. Amanda is free, truly, legally, permanently free. But freedom doesn't mean clarity. The questions still hang in the air like fog that won't lift. If Amanda was innocent, why did suspicion fall on her so heavily from the very beginning? Was it her behavior, her appearance, the language barrier, the cultural differences in how grief is expressed? If Rudy Guade didn't act alone, as some still insist, then who else was in that house that night? And if he did act alone, why did the investigation become so focused on two people who had nothing to do with it? And perhaps most haunting of all, why did so many different versions of events emerge? Over the years, why did stories shift? Why did the truth seem to change depending on who was telling it? The case leaves scars that go deeper than any individual. The Italian judicial system faces international scrutiny. Questions are raised about double jeopardy protections, about the power of media to influence justice, about how investigations are conducted when the world is watching. But beyond the courtroom, beyond the legal arguments and the appeals, something else has happened. This case has become cultural. It has seeped into the collective consciousness. It has sparked debates about justice, about gender, about how society judges young women, about the danger of trial by media. The impact would ripple outward for years to come, touching everything from how forensic evidence is collected to how the press covers criminal cases. And Amanda Knox herself? She becomes something no one could have predicted when she first arrived in Perugia as a hopeful student. A symbol, a warning, a story that refuses to be forgotten. Back in Seattle, Amanda Knox faces a different kind of prison. The bars are invisible now, but they're there, in every stranger's stare, in every whispered conversation that stops when she enters a room. in every Google search that will forever link her name to that night in Perugia. She tries to move forward. She sits for interviews, the camera lights harsh on her face as she answers the same questions again and again. She writes a memoir, pouring years of anguish onto the page. She participates in documentaries, hoping that maybe, just maybe, telling her story one more time will finally bring understanding. But understanding never quite comes. The world remains fractured in its judgment. Online, the debates rage on with an intensity that hasn't dimmed even slightly. Forums dedicated to the case attract thousands of people who dissect every photograph, every police report, every courtroom statement. They argue deep into the night, strangers from different continents united only by their certainty about what happened, even though their certainties point in completely opposite directions. To many, Amanda represents something larger than herself. She becomes a symbol of misogyny dressed up as justice, of how young women are judged not just by their actions, but by their appearance, their sexuality, their failure to perform victimhood the way society demands. They see in her case a warning about sensationalism run amok, about police errors that snowball into tragedies, about what happens when prejudice masquerades as investigation. To others, doubt clings like a shadow that won't fade. They pore over the evidence, convinced that somewhere in the contradictions and reversals lies a truth that was never fully revealed. They believe that justice was served initially and then undone by appeals and technicalities. Here's something that haunts the case to this day. Psychological studies have actually been conducted using Amanda Knox as a subject, examining why people remain so polarized despite having access to the same information. Researchers found that people's initial judgment, formed often within minutes of first hearing about the case, rarely changed regardless of new evidence. It's a chilling reminder of how the human mind works or fails to work when confronted with ambiguity. But amid all this noise, all these opinions, all this global attention, something tragic happens. Meredith Kercher's name begins to fade. The young woman who loved photography and languages, who had dreams and friends and a future stretching before her, becomes a footnote in her own story. The media circus around Amanda is so enormous, so consuming, that it eclipses the person at the heart of this tragedy. And perhaps that's the saddest part of all. A young life was taken in a way that no family should ever have to endure. The Kerchers, grieving an ocean away in England, watch as their daughter's memory is overshadowed by legal battles and media spectacle. They release quiet statements asking for privacy, for dignity, for their daughter to be remembered as more than a case file. Families on both sides are shattered. The Kerchers lose a daughter. Amanda's family spends years fighting for her freedom, draining their savings, their energy, their peace. Raphael's family endures the same nightmare, and the world watches it all unfold like it's entertainment, like it's a drama written for television instead of real lives being torn apart in real time. The case becomes a lens through which we can examine so many uncomfortable truths. About how the media shapes perception, about how justice systems can fail, about how quickly we form judgments and how stubbornly we hold on to them, about the price of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Decades pass, but the shadows don't lift. Every few years, the case resurfaces. A new documentary, a new interview, a new theory posted online. Amanda ages, builds a life, advocates for criminal justice reform, but she knows she'll never fully escape Perugia. It's tattooed on her identity forever. If this story has made you think differently about justice, about media, about how we judge others, consider subscribing. These are the cases that challenge us to look deeper, to question our assumptions, to remember that behind every headline are real human beings. The Amanda Knox case remains unresolved in the court of public opinion. The evidence has been examined and re-examined. The verdicts have been delivered and overturned and delivered again. But certainty, the one thing everyone craves, remains elusive. What we're left with is a story that refuses to fade, a reminder of how complicated truth can be, how justice isn't always clean or clear, how lives can be changed forever by events that happen in a single night. The case that divided the world continues to cast its shadow. And somewhere in that shadow, difficult questions still wait for answers that may never come. So here we stand, years later, looking back at one of the most controversial cases of the 21st century. What began as an unthinkable tragedy in a small Italian town became something far larger, something that transcended borders and languages, something that forced the entire world to take sides. The loss of Meredith Kercher shocked everyone who heard about it. But it was what came after, the chaotic investigation, the questionable interrogations, the dizzying cycle of convictions and acquittals, that transformed this tragedy into a global phenomenon that still hasn't released its grip on our collective consciousness. Stand in any room and mention the name Amanda Knox, and you'll see it happen. People's faces change, some with sympathy, others with suspicion. The divide is immediate, instinctive, almost primal. To many, she represents one of history's most egregious mistakes. A young woman caught in a perfect storm of prejudice, media hysteria, and investigative failures. They see her story as a cautionary tale about what happens when police work backward from a conclusion, when evidence is contaminated, when the presumption of innocence is drowned out by the roar of public opinion. To others, the doubt lingers like a question mark that won't fade. They believe that somewhere in the contradictions, somewhere in the multiple versions of events, somewhere in the shadows of that night, lies a truth that was never fully brought to light. They wonder if justice was served initially and then undone by technicalities and appeals. But here's what we can all agree on, regardless of where we stand. This case revealed something deeply troubling about the world we live in. It showed us how media coverage can transform a legal proceeding into a gladiatorial spectacle, how headlines can harden into truth before evidence is even examined, how a young woman's personality, her choices, her appearance, can be weaponized against her in ways that have nothing to do with guilt or innocence. It exposed how investigative failures, contaminated evidence, and procedural mistakes can send shockwaves through lives for decades. How justice systems, even in developed nations, can buckle under pressure and produce outcomes that leave everyone unsatisfied. Here's something that rarely gets discussed. Media scholars have since used this case as a primary example in journalism ethics courses worldwide. It's become a teaching moment about the real-world consequences of sensationalism, about the responsibility that comes with reporting on ongoing investigations, about the lives that hang in the balance when news becomes entertainment. But perhaps the most disturbing question this case forces us to confront is this one. How many times does the world convict someone before justice ever has its say? Think about it. Before Amanda Knox ever stood in a courtroom, millions had already decided. Based on what? A few news articles, some grainy photographs, the way she looked, the way she acted, things that had nothing to do with evidence but everything to do with prejudice dressed up as intuition. We like to believe we're rational, that we wait for facts, that we reserve judgment until all the evidence is in. But this case proves otherwise. It proves that we're all susceptible to the same biases that derailed the investigation in the first place, that we see what we want to see, that we judge based on comfort and confirmation rather than truth. And in doing so, we become part of the problem. Families were destroyed by this case. Not just the Kerchers, grieving a daughter whose memory was lost in the noise. Not just Amanda's family, fighting for years to bring her home. But everyone touched by this tragedy had their lives permanently altered by events that spiraled far beyond anyone's control. The case of Amanda Knox doesn't offer easy answers. It doesn't provide the closure we crave. Instead, it leaves us with uncomfortable truths about justice, about media, about ourselves. If you've made it this far, if this story has challenged you, made you think, made you question your own certainties, then drop a comment below. Share your perspective. Do you believe Amanda Knox was innocent? Or do you think there are still pieces missing from this puzzle? Your voice matters in this conversation. Because these cases, these real stories of real people, they're not just entertainment. They're mirrors reflecting back the world we've created and the world we're responsible for changing. Subscribe to True Crime Dossier for more stories that don't just tell you what happened, but make you think about why it matters. Hit that like button if this case made you see things differently. and turn on notifications so you never miss the true stories that continue to intrigue and challenge the entire world. Because the truth, as this case has shown us, is rarely simple, but it's always worth pursuing, even when it leads us to places we'd rather not go, even when it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the biggest mystery isn't what happened in that room on that terrible night. It's what happened to all of us as we watched, judged, and chose our sides. The case that divided the world still echoes today, and maybe, just maybe, that's exactly why we need to keep talking about it.